Hello.
We're back again.
He
Welcome to Crib Chat UK,
he Shabazz.
and here's Pete Marshall. And today we've got a guest. Would you like to introduce yourself, guest?
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Garcia. As you can guess, I am an American from my accent, and I am a journalist just writing a book about autism and public policy in America.
Okay. And to start with, could you tell us a bit about your journey into journalism?
Sure. Thank you very much, Shabazz. So I basically have been in journalism since I was in college when I worked for my college newspaper at the University of North Carolina, covering North Carolina politics in the South in America. And then I worked at a place called Market Watch, covering business journalism, covering about business and financial regulation. Then I worked at National Journal, where I wrote an essay that was widely received about autism and arguing that autistic people shouldn't be cured. And that led me to start writing about autism and public policy. In the meantime, I've written for Roll Call. I was an editor at The Hill. And then most recently, I was an editor at The Washington Post for a year. And elsewhere, I've also written for The New Republic, Salon, The Daily Beast, and I've also written for places like The Washington Post. So, and I have a book coming out on August of next year, August 3rd, through Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And as of right now, I'm working as a freelance journalist, writing mainly about politics, policy, disability, and anything and everything in between.
I mean, just to ask, I was going through one of your articles, and one part that you didn't mention there was your internship at the White House.
Yes.
So which president was that under, and what was that like?
That was under, that was during the Obama administration. I was actually an intern. Like I should say, like when you're an intern in any administration, it's not like it's like if you intern at Apple, you're not going to see Steve Jobs every day or Tim Cook. In the same way, I was an intern in the Office of the First Lady in the mailroom, which was actually at the time, it was at a remote location. The mailroom was in a remote location, obviously, so that mail could be read in a different place. It was not too far from the White House. But, I went to the East Wing frequently, and it was, that was basically reading and responding to all kinds of mail that was sent to the First Lady, their children, their mother-in-law, the dogs. A lot of kids like that. A lot of kids like sending letters to the dogs. So that was. I did that for 4 months when in 2011. So going on 10 years ago. It was a great opportunity. It was a great experience. It changed my life in a lot of ways, but it also taught me that I don't want to work in partisan politics, and I prefer being a journalist. So I know that the lines between partisan politics and journalism are very different in the UK than they are in the US. But I think that I realized that I'm much more comfortable being in journalism than I am in partisan politics in the U.S. So that taught me that. But it was the honor of a lifetime. It was really cool, and it taught me a lot about politics. And I've been working in political journalism ever since. So,
how did you come across that opportunity then?
So it's a really, really funny story. So before I went to the University of North Carolina, I was at community college, and I don't know how much. Is there something similar to the community colleges in the UK?
I think we'd probably just call them. They'd be like A levels.
Yeah,
and it would just we don't really differentiate mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
So like community colleges are, I guess you could say they're really a distinctly American thing, is that like a lot of times before people go to university, like if people want to go to a trade school, like just learn a trade or get a trade certificate, or if they want to spend their first 2 or 3 years at a university, a community college to save money before transferring to like a proper university. They're often run by the state. I was at a community college, and I actually got into the honors program at the university at Chaffey College, which is my community college, and I was partnered up with someone at in one of my classes, and we were talking, and I said, "Oh, well, what do you want to do one day?" She says, "I want to get into politics one day," and I thought, "That's cool." I said, "I maybe want to get into journalism," and then I think I was scrolling through the internet one night, and I texted her. I was like, "Oh, why don't you?" I was like, "Have you ever thought about applying for a White House internship?" And she says, I had a friend who did it. I'll do it if you do it." For whatever reason, she wasn't able to do it. She wasn't able to apply, I should say. And I applied, and for some godforsaken reason, they let some jerk like me in. So it was totally unexpected. So like, I mean, I was living in California at the time. I grew up in California, Southern California. It's like an hour out from Los Angeles. And moved to Washington D.C. I did that for 4 months. The coolest thing, I think, the most interesting time there, I think, was my last week there was the week that the president announced the strike on Osama bin Laden, and there was this.
Oh wow!
But like, what was funny? I mean, obviously nobody knew what was going on, but like, it was the week. It was the days after. It was just like really, really interesting to just be around everything. I think, God bless my parents. I think they were concerned about a counter strike happening in Washington D.C. So thankfully nothing happened. But it was like that was one of the real surreal moments where you're just thinking to yourself, "Wow, you're actually in the White House. The center of American and thereby world military power." It was really kind of a surreal experience. So,
did you ever meet the president?
So I should say, I never like formally met him, but he spoke to our intern class at in the Rose Garden. And I asked him a question during just general Q&A part when he was talking to the interns, but I've never actually met him when he spoke at my university. So after that, I transferred to university. I transferred to the University of North Carolina, which is on the other side of the country. And he spoke at my university. I actually shook his hand when he came out to speak at a rally, but I wouldn't say I've actually said "Hello, Mr. President, my name's Eric Garcia," things like that. I did meet the First Lady a few times, and she's a wonderful human being.
Well, that's good to know.
I mean, I suppose we should probably get onto actual autism policy.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose an interesting question here would be kind of because in the US they have a very kind of paid for system.
Yes.
That produces a very different system in terms of diagnosis. So would you like to talk about the kind of what happens, kind of how what that system looks like in practice, what it looks like theoretically, how good it actually works?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this with a few other people. Other people have told me about this. The real difficulty, what it does is that it creates a lot of
1 second, we can't hear you. Try again.
Can you hear me now? I can hear
Yes.
you.
Yeah, sorry.
I apologize. So yeah, one of the fascinating things is that it costs, depending on who you are, where you are, it can cost thousands of dollars, especially if you're an adult getting diagnosed. And so what it does is it creates a large gap of who can access the medical services to get diagnosed and who can't. So there are a lot of low-income people, people of color, Black kids, Latino kids, who don't get diagnosed, and even then, at the same time. So, to kind of compare, to talk about American government programs, the United States has a program called Medicaid, which is a government insurance program for disability, for poor people and poor people, pregnant women, and people with disabilities. It's a social insurance program. And even then, there was a survey in the 2000s, in the 1990s into 2000s, showing that Black and white kids getting diagnosed with autism, Black kids still get diagnosed later. So it's even in an apples to, America, our history of race is very, very fraught, and it's very, 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 is very difficult and has been very brutal. But so even then, the kind of schemas and how people are diagnosed, even when they have the similar access to healthcare, is even then very divided based on racial bias, doctor's bias, clinician's bias. So basically, what happens is that one reason why I believe the study in the UK was called the Brugge study that showed how many autistic adults there are in the UK.
Just to say, there are a lot of studies. So unless it's yeah. I probably know of it, but yes.
There was a specific study called the Terry Brugge study, or at least called the Terry Brugge study, that surveyed how many autistic adults there are in the UK, that showed it's about congruent to the amount of autistic kids there are in the UK. Yeah. It's a lot harder to do that in the US because there's not a universal system like the NIH that surveys and gathers and can gather and collect data. So as a result, we really don't know how many autistic adults. The CDC, which is, I should say, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, recently did an estimate that showed about 2.2% of adults in America are autistic. But again, that's just an estimate. There hasn't been a full-fledged survey, so it really makes it hard to know what if there isn't data on, if there aren't data on something, it doesn't exist. Basically, it makes it really hard to address.
This is a slightly random question, but it's an interesting one one of the most major differences between being an autistic activist in the UK and being an autistic activist in the US, because I know a few, and is the sheer quantity of kind of cures.
Right.
And in the UK, it's still an issue, but honestly, like, you have to work a lot harder, and like, you have to like actually try to like get that kind of information, and then it's you can go to the police, or you can go to various groups, and it's complicated and messy, but in some ways there's like this. So in my there's two questions here in the back of my head. Why is there evidently less need? Because there's less children going through these kind of non-medical cures for autism. Right. And and so to me it's like, do you think because the medical system like has a lot more distinct kind of money barriers around it, if you need help but you don't have the money to go into to get diagnoses, to get blah 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 blah, like, is that where kind of cures come in? Would the data support that kind of theory, or?
So I think the real debate and the real divide is the question on cures and whether to be cured. I think that's the real divide going on. I can't speak for what's going on in the UK, but I think there's a real divide among autistic activists and parents in the US about how much should there be a cure, whether they want a cure. Plenty of autistic people, including non-speaking autistic people, don't necessarily want a cure. So in the US, the real divide right now is. So one of the really interesting things about the U.S. is we don't think about the term United States. What that means, it's literally a union of states. Yeah. So health insurance, once again, going to the kind of maze of how much of how people navigate the healthcare system in America. Insurance is regulated on the state level. So among the states, not along the actual country. When I say state, I don't mean the actual. I say it on the state level. Yeah. So what happens is a lot of legislatures determine what is covered and what is paid for by insurers. Okay. So as a result, there is a big divide there that is often up to the that's under the jurisdiction.
1 second. I think your sound has cut out again. Okay, we got it now.
Yeah. So one of the things that makes it really difficult is that that even on, so for example, if you're looking at something like applied behavioral analysis, which is really controversial in the US, I don't know if there's that controversy in the UK. I can't speak to that.
There is somewhat, but carry on.
There's been a big push to make sure that that's covered under insurance. in the US. And while ostensibly that's seen as a good thing, plenty of autistic people don't necessarily like ABA, or they think ABA is a torturous process, or they think it uses conditioning or it uses aversives. So therefore it's not the right thing. So even then, so not only is there a divide about access to healthcare, which is definitely a thing, there's also a divide about what kind of therapies are even covered under insurance and whether it's the right thing that autistic people themselves want. And I think a big, and this goes to the kind of thesis of my book, is that for a long time, so it was parents who largely advocated for including ABA under insurance in the US. And for a long time, parents were the most, I would say from like the 1970s until the 2000s, parents were the leading voices in autism advocacy. And that was parents taking power back from doctors who had theorized for a long time that autism was caused by unloving mothers or unloving parents, or they were arguing that, and therefore the argument was that you need to institutionalize your kid or put them under the care of state hospitals or things like that, because they would be better off with that way. And I think that in the from the 1970s to the 2000s, parents were specifically saying, "You've been blaming us for too long. We're going to try to take our power back. We're going to try to do these." So they supported ABA, and I don't think it was necessarily under bad auspices. I think that they were trying to do what they thought was best. And now you're starting to see a power shift where self-advocates are saying, even now where they're like, yes, we want things to be covered under insurance. I think a lot of autistic people would rather say, okay, we would rather have the insurance cover things that are comorbidities, so things like gastrointestinal issues, epilepsy. We would rather have those things covered than actually trying to treat autism, to quote unquote cure autism itself. So there, even then there's that divide. That's a really long-winded way to answer your question, but it's to discuss how complicated and Byzantine a lot of the things are.
I mean, I'll just say, I think there's one contextual thing that's different because there's kind of, I would say there's two different kinds of ABA. And again, there is a vast debate there,
Yes.
you know, I agree. But one of the most major differences between the UK and the US is any kind of, again, there's going to be a slight gray area here, but like almost any form of aversive that you can think of. Basically, in ABA in the UK, you can reward, but in the end, punishment, you know, anything more than like ignoring the kid who's doing something you don't like is a no-no.
Right.
And so, whereas in the US, there is, until this year, there was like legally speaking, a judge only just closed down a school that was using electric shocks.
Yes. So
and again, the school, I think there's been a whole bunch of farrago around like whether the school has actually stopped doing it, and there's been a whole bunch of, you know, and so so just to say that is that,
So I mean, I think the so the specific institution you're thinking about is the Judge Rottenberg Center in Massachusetts, and there have been numerous lawsuits, including the state of Massachusetts, where it's based, has tried to file lawsuits against it. And a lot of Medicaid, going to the point about Medicaid, a lot of Medicaid dollars go to, or a lot of, I don't know if it's necessarily Medicaid, but a lot of government dollars go to, or insurance dollars go to this place. And it was only recently that the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates drugs and, you know, literally the food administration, ruled earlier this year, I think around March, saying that this is inhumane treatment and it banned this type of electroshock therapy. The problem is that a lot of parents support this type of electroshock therapy. It's graduated electronic decelerator, as I think the term, but GED something. But like it's basically it's a shock device that's like in a backpack. But yeah, like there is a real divide, and like you said, I think that's the main difference, is that I think that's a big difference between what's going on in the US and the UK. And
what is the benefit of that, do they say?
They would argue,
again,
I'm trying to be charitable toward them,
yeah,
is that this stops self-injurious behavior to both them and injurious behavior to other people to administer these types of things. There was the special rapporteur for the UN basically said that this violates human rights.
Yeah.
And there also plenty of states attorneys general, the FDA, things like that say that even if this, even if it did, it's still a gross infringement on people's rights.
I might say that, speaking as a person who has a degree in psychology, and we had to do ABA in that, and there was a whole bunch of the we had to do loads of the studies, and there was a fair amount of discussion about how some forms of ABA were highly statistically effective at certain things. And again, the autistic community might argue against even those, but I'm not going to go into the weeds in that one. But I think so I went to a fairly Reading University, very good university, but blah blah blah, very standard university. They're actually fairly kind of biology. They like their MRI scanners and things. So in the end, they're not in any way lefty radical blood, is what I'm trying to say. And they were well, we don't, they weren't trying to argue for it or arguing that the evidence is pro, electric shock. So again,
So I think the debate is starting to, oddly enough. So the FDA. So what's funny about it is, despite the fact that Trump administration has tried to, if we could talk a little about, because the policy is important here. For a long time, the Obama administration tried to oppose it. A lot of, it's based in Massachusetts. The facility is based in Massachusetts, so a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberal Democrats have tried to file lawsuits against it. But parents have pushed back. Oddly enough, it was the FDA under the Trump administration said that this is wrong. So even though the Trump administration has tried to scale back Medicaid and repeal Obamacare, which was something that gave insurance coverage to a lot of autistic people and disabled people, and the Trump administration has tried to roll back Medicaid even further than what Obamacare had. It was their administration it happened under the Trump administration. How much the Trump administration actually did it and how much it was government bureaucrats is a career of government bureaucrats is something I don't know. But oddly enough, the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, Trump's daughter-in-law, Laura Leah Trump, she spoke at the Disability Policy Summit call for the AAPD, the American Association for Persons with Disabilities. She spoke, and that was one of the first things she mentions is that they ended shock treatment, and it was surprising to me that they would tout that because because this is something the Trump administration hasn't really addressed a lot of things with disability, doesn't really talk about disability that much. So it was really fascinating to me that that would, given that's this much of what, because the Trump administration hasn't really it's not only that they've tried to roll back social insurance, it's that they just haven't addressed things on disability that much at all, even just the government bureaucrats. So.
And honestly, Trump's personal his statements in the past about vaccines and autism as an epidemic. I think in some ways this is an interesting, again, I'm speaking as unemotionally as possible here.
Yes.
But I think that it is there is a discussion to be had about Trump doesn't have no ideas on autism.
Right.
He obviously has thoughts that go through his head on autism. And yeah.
This is actually part of my book that's coming out next year. So if I may.
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand how Trump came to understand autism. Trump, it seems first came to learn about autism through Bob Wright, who was the head of NBC Universal, whose grandson Christian was diagnosed with autism, and Bob and Suzanne Wright helped found Autism Speaks.
Okay.
And what's also interesting about Bob Wright is he had an apartment, I believe, at Trump Tower in New York when he was running NBC Universal. I think I don't know. I think he lives in Connecticut, but like and commutes in New York. But like, yeah, or I forget the whole thing. But he had a hotel in Trump Tower, which is where Trump and Bob Wright was head of NBC Universal when NBC, the network, the television network, launched The Apprentice, which was Donald Trump's television show. And Trump has talked about Bob and Suzanne Wright, and of course, Autism Speaks. I'm sure, I don't know how much you guys know about it, but it's obviously very controversial in the U.S. with a lot of autistic activists. Because
in the UK, we've done a great deal of like pushing them as far away from the country as possible, to a significant degree, successfully, honestly. So
yeah,
they have very little like to do with the country, but yeah, sorry.
But it's important to recognize this because Trump's main ideas about autism come from Autism Speaks, and the reason why that matters is that because Bob and Suzanne. So Bob Wright has kind of he was supportive of Trump's candidacy for president in 2016, but more important to that, the Wright family itself has been really split between Bob and his late wife Suzanne, who died in 2016, I believe, and Katie Wright, their daughter, who is the mother of their son Christian, who has pretty firmly put herself in the vaccine camp. So there is a real
making an autism vaccine or anti-vaxxer?
Making an anti-vaccine claim that's claiming that because she calls herself part of a group called the Mercuries, which are obviously you can put two and two together, thinking that Mercuries played a role in autism vaccines. So that plays a role. But after that, I don't know how much Trump knows about vaccines. I don't know whether he sides with Katie Wright or Bob Wright, but I do know that they have cited that they went down to Mar-a-Lago a lot, which was Trump's resort in Florida. So it's real. So if there's kind of a skeleton key, and again, this is the extent to how much I know, and this is how much I tried to report and I tried to research and just wasn't able to find out much. I wasn't able to, but like, you would need to look at his relationship with Bob and Suzanne Wright, just because A, they're both rich people in New York. B, Bob and Suzanne Wright were instrumental to launching. It's important to recognize with Trump in the 1990s, Trump was kind of hitting a hard time. He had gone through some some of his resorts had gone through bankruptcy. Some of his businesses had gone.
Sorry, we can't hear you. 1 second. There, can hear you.
So it's important to recognize in the 1990s that Trump was facing a lot of financial hardships. He had gone through a divorce. Some of his properties had gone under. The Apprentice, the television show, is what really puts him back in the public eye as this business mastermind. Because up until then, he was kind of seen as kind of old news. He kind of lost a lot of the luster that he had in the 1980s when he was kind of at the top. That was when he was doing Art of the Deal, things like that. So if there's kind of a skeleton, you kind of need to look into that. That's something that I would like to look more into is that relationship. But another perfect example is that Trump is that in Bob Wright's own memoir, he even expresses disappointment that the Obama White House didn't light the White House blue for Autism Speaks and World Autism Day. The Trump administration did its first year, its first World Autism Day in 2017. I don't know if they have since then, but then in Trump's executive presidential proclamation, he also specifically talked about curing autism. So, which pissed off a lot of autistic self-advocates. So it was so that's a long way of answering your question about Trump as a really interesting relationship. And your idea, Trump doesn't have no idea about autism. He just has very, very convoluted ideas about autism.
Yeah. And to ask you now, could I ask you a bit about your journalism and what made you interested in journalism at the very start?
I think what got me into journalism was I wanted to be a guitar player, playing in rock and roll bands when I was in high school and in junior high school and high school. And I think my mom and my parent and my dad and my stepdad were kind of like, okay, buddy, you need to find something more stable. And I was just like, I was like, okay, I need to find something. And I was just like, and then like, I noticed I liked a lot of magazines. I used to read a lot of magazines about musicians and things like that. And then like, I liked learning the stories behind music. And then my guitar teacher was like, have you ever thought about music journalism? And I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. But I was like, seems like it allowed me to still keep doing what I want to do, be in that realm, and then, you know, get a paycheck to write about things. And I have a lot of thoughts. So sounds good, you know. And then I signed up for my high school newspaper in 2008, and then I mean high school newspaper after that. And then, you know, in 2008 there was the presidential elections. They needed people, just little small things about the 2008 presidential.
1 second. Yeah, the sound is. Try again. See what it's like now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. There.
So like, I mean, that was in 2008 when Barack Obama was running for president and John McCain was running for president, and it just seemed like that was a lot of fun. So I got into journalism that way, and then went to community college. Then when I worked at the White House, I realized, you know, I don't think I'm that. I was like, okay, my dad's a Republican. I don't think I'm much of a Republican. And then interning in a Democratic administration, I was realized, you know, I don't really feel like I fit in as a partisan in the Democratic Party either. I had my objections to the Obama administration on things like the war in Afghanistan. And then I realized I was changing my mind about foreign policy a lot, and I was changing my mind. So I realized, but I loved doing the Q&A sessions that we had at the White House, where we would have really prominent members of the Obama administration come speak to us. And I was like, I think I like asking questions more. So while I was at the White House, I found out I got accepted to the University of North Carolina to transfer. So I transferred there, and then I went to go work for my college newspaper. And that was really fun because I was in the 2012 election, and North Carolina, I'm sure as you're seeing now in 2020, that it's a swing state. You know, people think of North Carolina as a southern state, therefore it's just, you know, all conservative, but it's a swing state. You know, so I was like, this seems really interesting. So I covered North Carolina politics while I was in college, and it seemed a lot of fun. And I was like, okay, I'm going to be doing political journalism for the rest of my life. So did that. Then I worked at Market Watch for a little bit. That was my first job in journalism. And then after that, I went to go work for a place called National Journal, and I covered economic policy and politics for a while. That was a lot of fun because I covered a lot of labor unions. I covered financial regulations. By virtue of that, I got to follow around Elizabeth Warren a lot. This was back in 2015 because when we thought Elizabeth might run against Hillary Clinton. And by virtue of that, I got to cover Bernie Sanders a lot, you know, which was before Bernie Sanders became kind of the thing. Like I kind of saw that he was going to be a thing against Hillary Clinton. So that was a lot of fun. And then unfortunately what happened was the print magazine shut down and everything went behind a paywall. So God bless my editor, Richard Just. He was like, okay, I want these really kind of ambitious pieces. And that was how I wrote that kind of initial piece about autism.
Yes.
And politics and policy. And that kind of was the beginning of my writing about disability. After that piece came out, I was like, okay, I wrote that piece. I want to go back to normal political journalism. So when Roll Call went and changed things, when National Journal went and changed things, I went to a place called Roll Call, which basically covers Capitol Hill. Worked there for 2.5 years. While I was there, I signed a book deal, which I began writing this book. And then I worked at another place called The Hill. I worked there for a year. And then I worked at the Washington Post for a year. And in between there, you know, I've written for places like the Daily Beast. I've written for the Washington Post along with editing for them, the New Republic, things like that, you know. So, but basically, I've now been a journalist now in one way or another since college, since 2012, and I don't see myself stopping anytime soon. So,
I mean, I suppose. Sorry, another discussion to be had is what kind of disability stories kind of pop, like make editors go, yeah, I want to put this into the paper.
I think, you know, so I think it goes to the question, you know, you know. A lot of news and editors and news and journalism. So like when you're talking about daytime television, a lot of parents love the inspiring disabled story of like asking kids to the prom or disabled student, you know, gives the valedictorian speech. I think, I think to me, you know, and I don't necessarily think that those people are bad. I think, or like, you know, I think that it's more like, I think that they're for an audience that wants to feel good about something. And I don't know how I feel, and I don't like the idea of disabled people being used to make able people feel good. It would be just as condescending as using women to make men feel good or black people to make white people feel good.
I was just about to say disability porn, you know?
Yeah.
It's like
inspiration porn, as the late Stella Young said. I mean, it was kind of like a lot of white people felt good about themselves when Barack Obama got elected. They're like, "Hey, I voted for the black dude." You know, to me, that's kind of condescending because it doesn't. Yeah, you may have voted for the black dude, but you know, police shooting still happened when Barack Obama was president. You know, in the same way, I don't think, you know, to me, I think what makes, to me as an editor and both as a reporter, if you're going to pitch something about journalism or disability, I think to me what sticks out is, okay, the main questions about any journal, about any news story are who, what, when, where, and why. And I think that my general feeling is, you know, I go by this saying, I think David Simon said, is that like the way you think about it is shit's going down. Here's what I think is going down. And here's what I think can make it, can fix it. Those are kind of the questions I'm thinking about all the time. So to me, the stories that I think about disability.
1 second, the mic's gone down.
Beach Bass, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
So I think that like the thing that I've wanted to do is treat disability issues just like you would treat any other community's issues. And that's really what I try to do, is reframe it as my work as a journalist, is change it so that disabled people aren't objects of pity or objects of inspiration. They're a legitimate group of people who have legitimate needs. So for example, I'm thinking a lot about, just because it's on my mind a lot now, my really good friend Wesley Lowery, who I used to work with at the Washington Post, and he worked for 60 Minutes. He did a great piece about how guardianship prevents, how a lot of people under guardianship can't vote. That to me is a really important story, and not something I've seen for a long time, because it's like, okay, this is a problem for a specific group of people. And I should say, Wesley Lowery is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He's one of the guys who really started covering. He covered Michael Brown's shooting. He covered a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement. So like, that to me is a really important story, and it's not something I had thought of, because it's like, okay, people don't realize a lot of disabled people under guardianship can't vote. And then in the same respect, I think a lot of you've seen in states like Alabama, there have been bans on curbside voting. And that's something that really helps and affects a lot of disabled people, because a lot of people can only vote through curbside voting. And then, I'm friends with this woman named Abby. I'm friends with her too, but Maggie Astor at the New York Times, and she wrote a great piece about how, because a lot of disabled people during the coronavirus pandemic had to leave their ballots outside, it compromises the idea of a secret ballot, that your ballot is completely confidential. Those to me are more interesting stories than like, able people doing nice things for disabled people, because those are the things like, okay, there's a specific thing going wrong. How is it going wrong? Why is that the case? And what can be done to fix it? To me, I think that's what it's about. I think that as a news journalist and as somebody who cares about news, I think that like it really, the core issue should be about finding what, and I should say, I feel that way about every group of people, is that like, what's going on? What's going down? Why is it going down this way? And what could be done to fix it? That to me is just that to me is what journalism should be: is finding out what's happening and how is it, and what's wrong, and why is it going wrong. I think that's the core to me for anything.
Yeah, that just made me think about. I don't know if you know anything about this story, but do you know anything about the Britney Spears story?
Tell me about it.
She's in guardianship.
The guardianship story.
Tell me more about it. I hadn't heard about it.
I mean, honestly, this is a massive thing, and there's a English YouTuber who's done an amazing YouTube thing on this.
Okay.
We'll send you. We'll put up a link on our Twitter page, because it's just worth anyone listening to this. But basically, yeah, the bottom line is she is legally under guardianship of her father. I think, and it's a very weird, and it's a very complicated story because like she is a millionaire. She's ridiculously rich and going all over the world and doing all these shows and that lot. And at the same time, legally speaking, she can't actually access most of her money.
Oh yeah, Britney Spears. Is it the Britney Spears thing, or is that the...
Yeah, and it's a very like it's in some ways I think that this story is like this is the most upper class variant of it possible.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's it's an interesting kind of microcosm of this.
Rich people can be marginalized too. I mean,
yeah, they're rarely the center of the marginalized.
Right.
Yes.
I think about it. It's like it's like LeBron James had his house vandalized in Los Angeles. It doesn't matter how much money he has because he's still a black man in America, and he still can be in the same way. There can be wealthy disabled people who still can be marginalized. And in some ways I think sometimes it matters when really ungodly wealthy people face marginalization, because that's the only way then they become the face of things, and then people start to care about it.
I mean, I do think it is especially interesting in her case, the fact that I think she's tried to sue for like the lessening of the guardianship multiple times. And honestly, she has still not managed to get them to agree to it. And honestly, you do have to start to go, okay, if Britney Spears can't legitimately argue that she has a right to like decide what happens in her own life, then like how on earth is this working with other groups of people?
Yeah. My friend Sarah Ludeman wrote a great piece for The Nation. I'll tweet it to you guys one.
Sorry, the mic's gone dead. 1 second. Try now.
Yeah.
Can hear you.
Yeah. Because like I think one of the things that I think about a lot is, so a lot of I live in Washington D.C., which is a fairly upper income city, and I think about it because like a lot of people I know, what's fascinating is once I started writing about autism, a lot of people in media or in politics or things like that, or professors, academics, who say, "Oh, my daughter's autistic," and we've had a hell of a time trying to, and then I think to myself, well, if to your point, it's like, well, if they're having a hell of a time, how much harder would it be for a lot of people who don't have those resources, who can't, one of the things, so one of my good friends, his husband is a lawyer. And one of the first things they say when a kid gets diagnosed with autism in the US is, okay, get an IEP and then get a lawyer. Yeah. And like, but a lot of people can't afford a lawyer to fight for their rights. And I should say, this is why I don't like the term special needs, because when you talk about special needs, it sounds like you're getting special treatment. No, these are your rights in the law. Legally, these are your rights. It's not preferential treatment to make sure that you're treated fairly in school or in work and things like that. These are your rights as a person. And there are laws for that, but like to your point is that like the laws we already know how hard it is for wealthy disabled people to have the law work in their favor. How much harder must it be for the most marginalized disabled people to have the law work for them,
And just to get some clarity, you said get a lawyer and an AAP. What's an AAP?
So an IEP in the US is an individualized education plan, which is basically disabled students under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They are entitled to an individualized education plan that basically makes sure that they can, they have all the accommodations and needs that they make, and that they're meeting certain targets, and that they're following along academically. So an IEP is actually it's something that's actually they're underfunded and they're not nearly what they need to be, but they're a pretty good idea in theory, if not in practice.
I mean, just to say two things. The first thing is the English equivalent of that would be an educational healthcare plan. It's just the same thing, just a different acronym. There's probably minor variations around legal nuances. I mean, the interesting thing for me on this point, though, is the American education system. Its schools are funded from local taxes.
Yes, property
taxes, and that means that depending on the your in the UK be postcode. I think we like zip code in the US.
Zip code.
Basically, depending on how rich your neighborhood is, it depends how much money the school has.
Yes.
And again, I don't know how the special educational needs, whether that's funded from the same pot or whether that's funded from like a national. And so
there's I mean it's interesting because my sister is a teacher, so this is really fast. So this is really fascinating to me. But like so. Sorry. The interesting thing to me is that, like you said, it's funded by property taxes. But again, I grew up in Southern California. So long before I was born, in like I think 1975, 1976, California capped property taxes. But at the same time, in like the 1990s or the 2000s, they said, okay, we're going to double funding for education. Well, how do you think you get that money, you jerks? But then also on top of that, so for individualized education plans and for special education, the federal government has said when it was signed in 1990, the year I was born, it said that the federal government would fund around, I believe, 40% of this stuff for special education. It's never gotten, I think, above 20%. It's always somewhere like between 16 and 19%. So it's now about 30 years old. So one of the big divides one of the big questions during the Democratic primary in the U.S. Was like how much would, like almost every Democratic presidential candidate, with the exception of Joe Biden until he won the nomination, said we're going to fully fund or even increase funding for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So there's federal money that goes in for special education that they pledged to Senate, but the federal government has never lived up to its promise. So as a result, that money, states and localities wind up shouldering the cost. So that sucks because states, state education budgets are already strapped for cash.
So does that mean, so just to clarify in my own head, does that mean that schools basically gain a lump sum from the kind of the local property taxes? Like that's initial funding. And then they gain a kind of the special educational needs should come from federal, but they also gain like a third lump sum effectively from state.
Yeah, it's a really convoluted. I don't know how much state fund. I actually don't know how much state fund, so I can't quote on that. But I do know that localities usually pay a majority of it. And the federal government is supposed to shoulder the cost. The question is whether they actually do wind up shouldering the cost as much as they say that they're going to shoulder on paper. They never really have. So, but it makes for a very, very complicated funding system. But once again, it goes to our kind of convoluted federalist.
And honestly, this goes to a question for me, which is a very common one. I've noticed that professionals only ask for as much money as they think they can get.
Yes, correct.
And this very often means that from my experience, if they're working with somebody who they think it's going to be a hell of a job getting funding for X amount of money, then they'll just start with that assumption and just go, okay, what can I do with half the money? And then if they can, and so I mean, does that happen in the American education system? Like
absolutely, it does. I think a lot of times, I forget, there was a great anecdote, but like I think a lot of times parents worry, and a lot of social workers and a lot of clinicians and a lot of education workers and a lot of special educators. There are a lot of them who are there for the right reasons. I don't want to denigrate them. They're trying to work with the resources they have, and they're trying to think about, okay, how do we maximize the amount of funding we can get, and also how do we. So a lot of times they'll start with an opening bid, kind of knowing that it'll be lowballed, knowing that it'll actually get less money or fewer dollars. So like you begin a lot of times by negotiating with yourself, even before making that opening bid with the school system, which makes for a hell of a time.
But I think this would mean that if you're a kid from Bel Air, for example, I think
Yes.
you would, your the special educational needs there, you could probably get probably second to none, and they would be asking for much more money in their opening bid, and than if you were from, I don't know, rural Alabama. I'm kind of guessing.
No question. This is a big problem. This is a really big problem. Not to mention a lot of these states, because they're once again, I hate to make it, everything is about race, but like, not to mention that, most likely if you're from Bel Air, you're mostly white. You mostly were able to get a diagnosis. Let's not forget that, like, people in Alabama, particularly if you're African American, it's going to be harder to get a diagnosis. It's probably going to be, and unless you have that actual piece of paper, you can't really get the services. So even then, it's really, really difficult. So,
and could I just ask you a bit about your job as an editor when you did that?
Sure, yeah.
How did you find that? Like,
editing is a very different beast. I'm one of those people who believe that all editors should know how to write, and all writers should edit a little bit. It's a very different skill set. I think it requires a very different way of thinking. I think you have to be a lot more astute, I think you have to be more patient. I think there's a lot of delayed gratification as opposed to instant gratification. I think that it's a good skill set to have. I think it's very important. It's just something that I'm not naturally, I don't think it's something that I'm naturally good at, but I try like hell when I do try to add it to be as good as I can with other people. I think a lot of it also, it requires a lot of empathy for writers. It requires a lot of, okay, how do I best help them say what they're trying to say without getting in their way?
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very I think it's a very unique skill set. And the editors I've had, I tried to take the most I could from the great editors I had. Yeah. Hopefully I did good enough. But I think that what I always try to do is I always try to have those editors in mind, because I'm lucky to say that I've had great editors, so I think it requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of back and forth with the writer, making sure that you're not putting words in their mouth, and also making sure that you don't add anything unnecessary to that. But then also being something where it's like, okay, is this necessary to their argument, or can we take this out? Or is this necessary? Or are they saying this in the right way, or can I correct it to make sure that it's said in a different way? It requires a lot of patience. It requires a lot of being willing to set.
Does it require a lot of diplomacy?
It does require diplomacy. It requires a lot of diplomacy. It requires a lot of understanding where the person is from, and making sure that you're not telling them that it's not a personal thing, that you're trying to help them. Yeah. But then also recognizing where you're like, okay, maybe I might be wrong and maybe they might be right. So it requires a lot of, like I said, diplomacy with both yourself and the other person. Yeah.
And now moving swiftly on to your book.
Yeah.
Could you first tell us how you thought about, how you came up with the idea of writing this book in the very first instance?
I can tell you the exact story about it. I was at a party I want to say 5 or 6 years ago. I was at a party, and the host of this party, guy who's a journalist, his name is Tim Mack. Really good guy. I like him a lot as a person. First time I met him, I'd been invited by one of his friends. He said, "Oh, do you want a drink?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't drink because I'm on the spectrum." Later on, I did kind of have a problem with drinking, but I'm sober now. But like I said, but a medicine I take doesn't agree with alcohol. And then he's like, "Oh, there are a lot of autistic people in Washington, D.C." He's like, "You should write about that." And I was like, "Oh, I'm not good enough yet. I just graduated from college. Like, when I get good, I'll do that." I didn't want to think. I didn't want to have too high of an opinion of myself. What happened was National Journal, when I was working at the time, decided that they were going to shutter the print edition. So my friend Richard just decides that he wants to have these really, really ambitious, audacious pieces, which God bless him, And so I pitched this idea to him. Initially, we thought it'd be a fun kind of front of the magazine kind of chatty piece. So then he said, what's the point of this? And I think I kind of like when editors or when my boss kind of like challenge me on that, because then like it forces me to think on my feet, And then I said, like, well, we focus too much on trying to cure autism and not enough on trying to help autistic people live fulfilling lives. It's like, there's your piece right there, 10,000 words, get it to me in a month. And I was just like 3 months. And I was like, okay. And then I walked out and I was like, Jesus Christ, what did I do? But, it slimmed down to 6,500 words. But that happened. And then I thought to myself, and then around the same time, this is around 2015. And once again, I grew up in, I hate to keep on saying this, but I grew up in Southern California. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, but I noticed what was happening in Southern California was there was a big measles outbreak, if you remember, at Disneyland around that time. I don't know if this is news over the UK, but there was a big measles outbreak in Disney, like in Southern California, because a lot of people weren't vaccinating their kids with the measles vaccine.
Oh, I vaguely remember. Anyway, sorry, Karen. Yeah.
At the same time, Donald Trump was starting to lead in the polls. And that was when he said autism was becoming an epidemic and things like that. And then I remember thinking to myself, oh my God, we don't know how to talk about autism because everything was beginning and ending with vaccines or curing autistic people. And I was just thinking to myself, this is disconnected from what autistic people really need. This isn't helping them get a job. This isn't, or if they can't work, this isn't helping them with getting Social Security benefits or welfare benefits. This isn't helping them find independent housing outside of institutions. This isn't helping them with their healthcare issues. This isn't helping them with graduate from college or graduate from high school. This discussion is disconnected. And the problem I felt was that we were still operating from a system that thought that autistic people were defective. And I thought that, well, what if we lived in a world? Well, what if we had a magic? If I had a magic wand, what would society look like if we actually focused on trying to help autistic people in all those different sectors? And if we stopped thinking about autism in the US, at least, as something that really only affects white boys, because I don't know if you can tell by my skin color, I'm more than a white boy. I'm a 29-year-old Latino dude from Southern California. But and I just thought, okay, so we need to redefine and relook at the conversation. So as a result, I basically traveled around the country and tried to figure out what would this look like. So I went to the Bay Area to a place called Square, which is owned by the people who founded Twitter. The guy who founded Twitter, I'd like to see, because they have a real autism-friendly workspace. But also I went to Nashville, Tennessee, at Vanderbilt University, where their autism center is run by a guy who is autistic, Dave Caudale. I went to West Virginia to see how Marshall University is working with autistic students.
How easy was it to get access to these places?
It took, some places were more willing than others.
Yeah.
But a lot of times it was just guessing. A lot of times it was just guesswork.
Okay.
And it was just being put in contact with the right person who led me to the right person who led me to the right person. Sometimes it was just guesswork. Other times it was like I knew somebody who knew somebody, and that led me to the right place. But some places were harder than others, to be honest. But I think that was what I tried to do, is I really wanted to, because I think when that initial magazine piece came out, I think that, when I started working on this book, I think a lot of people wanted me to turn it into a memoir, but my feeling was there are a lot of, and I'm not bagging on them. I'm like, there are a lot of other memoirs. And I'm like, I'm 25. At the time I was 25 years old. I was like, I'm 25 years old. I don't have anything to say about my life yet. Hopefully, I haven't done anything really remarkable, and I was like, but I'm a journalist. I'm a political, I was thinking to myself, I'm a political journalist. What if I approach autism and I approach disability the same way I approach, I was an economy reporter at the time. I covered the economics. What if I approach it the same way I approach the economy, or people approach, racial injustice, or what if people, what if I approach it that way? And that was really the way I kind of did it. Is I was kind of like, I don't want this to be just about, to the extent I do include stuff about my own life in the book. Like, I don't want to, but like, I was like, I'm only doing it to the extent that I can see how much of a trend this is going on elsewhere. So
Yeah.
that was really what I was trying to do.
Yeah, but I suppose anybody that does any kind of writing, you can't help but write a bit about. You can't help but write a bit about your own experience anyway.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, there's that old saying, research is me search. So
Yeah, because that happens naturally. So, how would you say the process has been about writing the actual book? Have you enjoyed it, or have you?
I forget. I think it was Dorothy Parker who said, I hate writing, but I love having written. I'm those people who I like being a reporter. I love talking to people. I'm a genuinely curious person.
Yeah.
I think that you need to be curious as a journalist. I think you need to be. I think you need to have some kind of desire to learn about what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
So like I love that. I love digging through files. I love looking at peer-reviewed journals. I love interviewing people and talking with people and reading stuff and things like that. I think the real hard thing was like I think this book is 288 pages. I'd never done anything that long.
Yeah.
So I think it was just a matter of determining, okay, what is each chapter going to be about? Who are the people I'm going to center in each chapter? Who are the people I'm going to profile? And like, how do I think the one thing that the hardest thing, if I could say one thing, this might be the answer to your question. If there was one really hard thing to me about this, is I think that autistic people, disabled people, particularly autistic people, because a lot of autistic people either can't speak or they're seen as, oh, you're not really autistic because you can't speak. A lot of their own narratives and their own life stories are often called into question. And the capacity to tell their own stories is often called into question.
Yeah.
So I take it. I was very honored whenever any autistic person told me their story, and or told me what they were, or was willing to tell me about their life experiences. I think that is I take that very, very serious. I don't take myself seriously, but I take that very seriously.
Could I ask you a question on this?
Yeah.
How much did you go into how much did you stick to kind of autism and that and that field, and how much did you kind of, because you talked about independent living, and obviously there's the independent living movement as part of the social model, and so there are other kind of ways of thinking groups that have done work around this. How much did you go into their stuff? How much did you stick to?
I think that I wanted to put it into a larger context. I wanted to put autism and neurodiversity within the larger context of it. And I don't think you can talk about autism and neurodiversity without talking about those larger movements. So I tried to put in as much of that as I can to give kind of to let people know that this doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So I think that so I wanted, and plenty of people in the autism community got their start in those movements. So I wanted to make sure that I included that. I wanted to make sure that I wanted to make sure that I included as much as I could about them and get their stories accurately and treat them with dignity and respect, and not treat them as an oddity or a curiosity. I think that at the end of the day, I think a lot of journalists feel like they need to have some kind of distance with the people they interview. And I think to some extent distance is good. I do believe that. But I don't think that it should inure you from understanding that there's from other people's humanity. And I do want to be empathetic. As much as people talk about autistic people not being empathetic, I do want to be empathetic, and I want to make sure that they trust in me. This is something that's going to be read by a lot of people that they don't know. And I care a lot about making sure that their story and their narrative, your story is really what you have. Your name and your reputation and your narrative is really how people know you and how you carry yourself through this world. So I wanted to make sure, and God help me if where I accurately did it is because they were still willing to talk to me. Where I fell short is totally on me. But I wanted to make sure that I told their stories as accurately as possible, and I hope to God that I did it the right way.
Yeah, and that just makes me think about, like, if you had a magic wand, what would you want the effect of this book to be?
Um, I think what I would want more than anything is I would want autistic people, I would want loved ones of autistic people to see that as much work as there are a lot of good parents and a lot of good caretakers and social workers and things like that, but they're still operating from the idea that there's something wrong with their loved ones, with their autistic loved ones. I think what they should see is that there's nothing wrong with them. It's what's wrong is the fact that they don't have the things that they need to live a fulfilling life. A good, fulfilling life is possible if you're disabled, if you're of any kind. Especially
1 second, we can't hear you.
hello.
Okay, we heard that.
Hello,
Yeah.
could you start that again? Sorry.
Yeah. So I think a lot of other disabled activists or disability rights activists have done a good job of saying that they have worth in this world and that they are worthwhile. I think that autistic people are playing. I think a lot of the autism community and autistic people are playing catch up in a lot of ways. I think if I could have any kind of effect, it would be that that the people who love autistic people will recognize that they're not deficient and recognize that even if they have the best intentions, that it's still not about them, that it's still about autistic people. And I hope, and there are plenty of parents, people think that autistic self-advocates hate parents. I don't hate parents. Candace Rojas Rosa is an amazing parent. She does Thinking Person's Guide to Autism. Nicole Cliff is a phenomenal, lovely human being herself. She herself just recently got diagnosed as autistic, but before then, one of her kids was autistic. Nicole Chung, who's a writer. She's a phenomenal parent. So like,
Shockingly enough, all autistic people have parents.
yeah, exactly.
You wouldn't believe it, but
Yeah. But it's not all parents are bad and not all parents are good and not all autistic people are good. But it's just a matter of parents making sure that they center what their kids' needs are above their own needs. So I really so if I could do that, if I could have one, and the other thing I would want on the larger macro level is I would hope that by parents, look, I'm a political reporter, I'm a political journalist. Politicians are only as good as the information that they're given. And for a long time, I think that because the information that politicians were given was that autism was something that needed to be cured, they responded that way. So if there's a macro thing that if more and more people realize that autistic people are not defective and that they just need accommodations and they need acceptance, I hope that trickles up to the top, or that moves to the top rungs, that moves into the halls of power in Washington. I hope that, my feeling is, when I wrote something for Roll Call that was on the front page of Roll Call, which is the newspaper I worked at on Capitol Hill, people on Capitol Hill read it. And my hope is that enough powerful people read this book and that it changes how they view autism. That's all.
I think that's a great way to end the actual interview.
Yep.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
It's been wonderful having you here, despite the fact that the internet seems to be fighting it.
Yeah. All right.
But yes, it's been great having you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everything.
Right. Okay. See ya. Bye.
Yeah.
Right.